Chapter 9. Resisting Through Exodus. Mary Carol Miller was a sophomore at Greenwood High School in January 1970. Her mother was a journalist for the Memphis Commercial Appeal, so Mary Carol and her sister were probably better versed than their peers about the desegregation cases making their way through the courts and the possible ramifications of the ruling for them and their school. What Mary Carroll was not prepared for was the sudden departure of most of her white friends to Pillow Academy, a private school begun in 1966. She explained, when the court ordered integration came full force, kids started bailing out. About half of our 10th grade class left within a couple of weeks of that. My memory of that is lockers changing, clanging in the hallway as kids cleaned out their lockers. They were coming to school, handing in whatever they had to hand in to get their records and get out. 800 white students left the Greenwood Municipal Separate School District in the first months of 1970. School Board Attorney Hardy Lott, in a July 30th, 1970 letter to Jairus Leonard, Assistant Attorney General, blamed the federal lawsuit against the school board as taking the school district a great deal farther down the road to becoming an all black school district. On the same day, Lott wrote Senator James Eastland asking his help in ensuring Leonard read his letter. Dear Jim, the time is short, as we must prepare and file in Greenville not later than August 13th. Any suggestion the school board has is about the last hope for the school district and the school board, and I think it urgent that Mr. Leonard examine the matter, even though we do not have much hope of any results from him. The exodus of white students from public schools in Greenwood was not unique. As court enforced desegregation occurred, private school enrollment soared. In some towns, like Canton, Woodville, DeKalb, Macon, Holly Springs, Tunica, and Liberty, almost every white student left the public schools within the first year of court enforced school desegregation. What to do with private schools plagued white superintendents and school board members whose immediate concern was the retention of white students in their schools. In many communities, whites organized Friends of Public Schools or some variation thereof to demonstrate their strong opposition to private schools. In other towns, the school board and superintendent openly supported the newly formed private academies with donated or greatly reduced gifts of land, facilities, and other resources. The public private school debate divided the white community in some towns, leaving severed friendships and church divisions in its wake. In a few towns like Tupelo and Oxford, the private school movement never gained much momentum due largely to the efforts of a well organized and very vocal business community. And in at least one town, Yazoo City, the white power structure waged a vigorous campaign to support public schools, while many of those same business leaders sent their own children to the local private school. They believed the two systems of schooling could coexist. The private school movement also weighed heavily on local black residents who saw obvious ploys used by the governor down to the local school boards to support private schools. Tuition grants, retaining private school teachers on the local school system payroll, and selling buses for pennies were simply a continuation of 15 years trying to impede school desegregation. Civil rights attorneys and black activists had to devote time and resources to filing lawsuits not for their children to have the right to go to desegregated schools, but to challenge the local, state, and even federal appropriation of public monies to support private schools. In 1970, Charles Evers called for black Mississippians to boycott white merchants who openly supported private schools. We don't want any violence, he declared. We just don't want to go to support private schools in any form. If the white merchants are going to go on record supporting private schools, we're not going to buy from them. Evers predicted that the private school movement would pass and that whites would return to the public schools. Evers was not alone in his optimism that the private school movement would be short lived. Auden Carter Jr., editor of the Delta Democrat in Greenville, espoused similar sentiments in 1972. Some of the new academies will undoubtedly continue to operate for a few years more, with ever fewer students and higher costs. A small handful may become permanent fixtures in their communities, enclaves for the affluent and the irredeemably bigoted. By the fall 1970, 158 accredited private academies were operating in Mississippi, and by 71, 20% of white students, 63,242 in Mississippi, attended private schools. Some whites did return to the public schools after the desegregation dust settled. However, in many parts of the state, private schools did, indeed, become permanent fixtures. Today, approximately 10% of Mississippi's school age population attends private academies, the bulk of them formed in response to court enforced desegregation. The Citizens Council and the birth of the private school movement in the South. Following the heels of the passage of the Civil Rights Act in July 1964, the Citizens Council devoted its entire September issue of The Citizen, to their monthly newspaper, to private schools. The issue signaled a major shift in the council's mission as reflected in the opening editorial entitled Government Schools. Until the misuse of federal power can be reversed, until the conservative white majority can recapture national political power, the obvious alternative for concerned parents who do not wish to surrender their children to government schools is to provide private schools which will be responsive to the wishes of the patrons. The rhetorical use of the term government schools to refer to public schools was meant to convey that public schools were the pawns of the federal government. This rhetorical tactic also allowed the council to situate public schools as part of a federal government agenda to override states' rights and the power of the people, that is, white people. The council cited in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as the ultimate imposition of the federal government into the affairs of states by forcing citizens to pay taxes for schools that, instead of being responsive to the wishes of the public in a local community, the schools are now being forced to obey the wishes of government in far-off Washington. The pages that followed offered a manual for how to start a private school, covering a wide array of topics from how to select a principal and teachers, to finances, to curricular and extracurricular issues, to transportation, and textbooks to accreditation. The newspaper ends with a simple charter of incorporation for readers to use in the establishment of their own private school. In 1966, the Citizens Council of America held its 11th annual leadership conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Its executive director, Lewis W. Hollis, announced that the promotion of segregated private schools is now the major project of Citizens Council. For 10 years, the Citizens Council had fought to preserve segregated public schools. Now they were calling for a mass exodus from them. The Citizens Council opened its first private school, Council School 1, in Jackson in 1964 for grades 1 through 6, with one principal, 3 teachers, and 22 students. Because their building was not ready, they held classes for several weeks in the home of one of its board members, Dr. Charles Neal. Governor Ross Barnett held a fundraiser in his home to help raise money for the new school's library. In fall 1965, the school expanded to include grades 1 through 12, and its students' enrollment increased to 110. Council School 2 and Council School 3 opened in 1966, with a total attendance at all three schools of 200. In 68, the Council School Foundation helped form the Mississippi Private School Association. In the 68 to 69 school year, enrollment at all three council schools increased to approximately 500 students. By the spring of 70, it had climbed to 3,000 students. At Council School 3 alone, the enrollment grew from 120 in 1969 of fall to 1,521 in spring of 1970. The influx of new students resulted in the hiring of an additional 51 teachers, 32 new buildings, and 52 new classrooms. By August 1970, the Citizens Council was operating 5 private schools in the Jackson area with an enrollment of 5,000 students. The Citizens Council focused on the state's most populous area to launch its private school movement, but private academies also opened in rural areas of the state. Bayou Academy in Bolivar County and Kruger Chula Academy in Holmes County both opened in 1964. By 66, 55 private schools were operating in the state. However, private school enrollment did not grow at the rate the council predicted, and the majority of whites chose to remain in the public schools. A number of factors account for initial slow growth of the private school movement. Many white Mississippians simply could not afford the tuition of a private school. Plus, community identifies in many small towns were attached to their local public schools. Further, most white Mississippians were not ready to concede that desegregation was inevitable, and the adoption of freedom of choice plans in many school districts throughout the state allowed most school districts to continue operating a dual and still segregated system of public schooling for the most of the 60s. As Table 9.1, which I will say out loud, illustrates, the growth of private schools was minimal from 1966 through 68. However, from 68 through 70, the number of students attending private schools in Mississippi almost tripled as the Alexander v. Holmes Board of Education case wound its way through the courts, culminating in the 1969 Supreme Court ruling ordering immediate desegregation. By the mid 1970s, the Citizens Council influence and power on state and local politics had greatly waned, and it was plagued by internal struggles, but it laid the foundation for a strong private school network, and its Jackson headquarters continued to operate as a clearinghouse and resource center for the hundreds of private schools operating in the state. In Table 9.1, here's the private school growth in Mississippi from 1966 to 1973. The three columns are year, total private school enrollment, and sample listing of private schools formed. 1966, 21,333. Delta Academy, Pillow Academy, and Tunica Academy. 1967, 21,817. Rebel Academy. 1968, 23,181. Delta Academy High School, Humphreys Academy, Marshall Academy, grades 1 through 8. 1969, 44,497. Benton Academy, Greenville Christian, Manchester Academy, Marshall Academy High School, Newton Academy, Starkville Academy, and Winston Academy. 1970, 63,242. East Rankin, Jackson Preparatory Academy, Kemper Academy, Lamar Academy, Middle and High, Magnolia Heights Academy, Washington School, and West Tallahatchie Academy. 1971, 64,196. Heidelberg Academy, Hillcrest Christian, Strider Academy. 1972, 62,366. Sylvia Bay Academy. 1973, 62,021. No sample listing of private schools formed. Regional proliferation of white academies. Most private schools established in the late 1960s were not directly affiliated with the Citizens Council. Rather, they formed through grassroots efforts with local parents at the helm. The creation of Kemper Academy in DeKalb is illustrative. In a drenching rainstorm in November 1969, white parents crowded into the Kemper County Courthouse in downtown DeKalb to vent their anger with the recent Alexander v. Holmes case. Their overriding sentiment had been captured a week earlier in the Kemper County Messenger with the headline, Federal Court's Actions to Ruin Kemper Schools. The main topic of the meeting was the formation of a new private school. In attendance was the headmaster of the nearby private school in Noxubee County, who fielded questions about the problems and possible solutions the community might encounter in opening a private academy. At the end of the meeting, parents completed a form stating their interest in the private school and the names and grades of their children. By the end of November, Kemper Academy had been birthed and was accepting applications for headmaster. When the public school reopened in January 1970 under court-enforced desegregation, few white students remained in the public schools. Most were enrolled at Kemper Academy. This type of almost overnight creation of private schools was common throughout the state. In Jackson in 1970, a group of mothers conceived of opening a private neighborhood school, and 24 hours later, they were operating a school in a bus directly across the street from Lake Elementary School, a public school with a full-time unpaid certified teacher. In Canton, a local tent factory was converted to a private school. When Canton Academy opened, almost no white students remained in the public school. Lacking a physical facility was not a deterrent in most communities, as local white churches offered to house the academies until more permanent facilities were secured. In 1965, Country Day Academy and Marks opened in Marks Presbyterian Church. The same year, Central Holmes Academy opened with classrooms in First Methodist Church and First Baptist Church in Lexington. In Natchez in 1970 of January, 16 Baptist churches partnered to support and establish an all-white private school. That same year in Tunica, their new private school, the Tunica Church School, held classes for an entire semester in the Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches. By 72, 19,662 students in Mississippi were attending private schools affiliated with their local Protestant churches. In 1970, private schools were operating in 56 of the 82 counties in the state. However, the majority of private schools were located in three main regions: the Delta, the Southwest, and in Jackson. From 1963 through 70, 19 private schools for whites were opened in the Delta counties of Bolivar, Washington, and Coahoma alone. In contrast, in the northeastern pocket of the state, comprising the counties of Benton, Tippah, Union, Pontotoc, Alcorn, Prentiss, Lee, Tishomingo, and Itawamba, Alcorn was the only county with a private school. The proliferation of private academies in certain regions of the state can be traced to several historical, economic, and demographic factors. Michael Fouquet notes that the Delta was a fertile ground for the birth of the private school movement because of its long standing anti public education sentiment. Fearing that an educated slave and, after the Civil War, an educated newly freed slave would be detrimental to the plantation economy, affluent Delta planters fought the establishment of any form of public schooling. Once established, they fought vigorously against any financial support of schools through tax revenues. When desegregation was court enforced in the 1960s, many Delta farmers were wealthy enough to financially back the private schools through donations of cash, land, and buildings. They also often paid the tuition of poor whites in their employ. However, the most significant variable for explaining the concentration of private academies in these regions in the population demographics. In his 1971 senior thesis at Princeton University, Luther Munford studied the correlation between white flight to private schools and the racial demographics of school districts named in the Alexander case. Munford reached the following conclusions. White children abandoned public schools of the Alexander districts roughly in proportion to the percentage of the black population in each district. No more, no less. Every district with a population 20% or more black lost white students. Districts with a population almost 70% Negro lost almost all their white enrollment. As illustrated in Table 9.2, which I will read out, the regions of the state with the highest percentage of black students experienced largest exodus of whites from their public schools. However, when each of these regions, certain school districts were able to retain white students during the first years of desegregation. For example, in Greenville, 30 to 40% of white students remained in the public schools for several years. In the Western Line school districts, white comprised the majority of students at Riverside Elementary and High School, and in Yazoo City, the majority of whites stayed in the public school the first semester, although the number significantly decreased by the following semester. Hence, other variables affected the degree of white flight in these communities, including the implementation of segregated classrooms within desegregated schools, concerted community support for public schools, income level of the white population, and strong cooperative leadership within and between the black and white communities. Table 9.2. Percentage of black school-age population and white students in non-parochial private schools by region, 1971 to 72. With the three columns being region, percentage of school-age population to black students, and percentage of white students in private academies, with the region of Delta, 67.7 black students, and white students, 37.2%. Southwest, 57.2 versus 33.6. Jackson Metro, 47.3 versus 34.1. East Central, 46.1 versus 14.6. North, 38.1 versus 7.2. Southeast, 28.8 versus 4.5. Public aid to private schools. After the Alexander v. Holmes ruling, Governor John Bell Williams declared that Mississippi could easily accommodate both a private and a public school system as long as the local two systems agreed to cooperate. For instance, it might be well for school administrators in communities where needs are great and the facilities limited to make arrangements with legitimate private school administrators for the use of their physical facilities at times and hours where they are not required for public school purposes. The same spirit of cooperation should exist between our churches and private schools, even as it exists now between our churches and the public schools. I'm strongly of the opinion that we must preserve our public school system as an absolute necessity for the good of all. On the other hand, a strong private school system may very well supplement and add strength to our public schools. By the summer of 1970, the explosion of the private school movement throughout the South concerned many in the federal government, and they directed their attention to the spirit of cooperation, developing between many private and public school systems in the South. In July 1970, Attorney General Ramsey Clark delivered a passionate address to the Senate Committee on equal education opportunity, urging Congress to stop the rapid proliferation and segregationist activities in the South. He implored, "We prohibit segregation in public facilities and public accommodations. Do private schools have less impact on the general welfare than hotels, restaurants, or bowling alleys?" On August 6, 1970, Walter Mondale, chair of the Committee of Equal Education Opportunity, questioned HEW Secretary Elliot Richardson as to what his agency was doing to deter the growth of private segregationists schools in the South. Mondale pointed out that it was common knowledge that many of these private schools were being greatly aided by the public schools, who were donating land and facilities and transferring teachers and equipment. Mondale pressed Elliot about the HEW conducting a thorough investigation of such practices. Elliot replied that at the time it was simply not feasible to deploy a large number of investigators to the South to check on the operations of the academies. 5 days later, Stephen Pollock, former Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights under President Lyndon Johnson, delivered an 18-page report to the Committee on Equal Education Opportunity, in which he discussed, among many other problems, private schools in the wake of desegregation enforcement. He argued that these academies and the racial isolation they perpetuate should be a matter of direct federal concern. Like Mondale and Ramsey, he urged the federal government to intervene when it is clear that the state or local government agencies become involved in their operations. Back home, ample evidence pointed to a history of the state offering significant help to private schools. In 64, Governor Paul Johnson called for a special session of the Mississippi legislature to approve a $185 tuition grant for private schools. It passed. Almost immediately, 600 students in 16 private schools used grant money to attend private schools. By the next year, the tuition of more than 1,700 students in 26 private schools was being paid or partially paid through these state grants. By 1968, 49 academies were being partially funded through these grants. In 68, the legislature raised the tuition grant to $240. In 1969, the Federal District County in Coffey versus State Educational Finance Commission ruled the tuition grants unconstitutional. After the court's ruling, the Mississippi legislature approved a bill allowing students 16 years and older to borrow money on their own to be used to pay tuition at colleges, universities, junior colleges, vocational schools, and private schools. The student loan program allowed money to go directly to students rather than to private schools, although the bill was clearly intended as aid to private schools. Senator Theo Smith of Corinth, who cast the only dissenting vote in the Senate, noted that the irony that minors who did not have the right to vote could, under this law, borrow money and put themselves in debt. Thousands of dollars for a high school education. A provision of the law allowed this debt to be forgiven if the students remained in the state to live or study. Private schools in some areas were greatly boosted by the direct and indirect aid they received from their local school boards and city councils. For example, the Canton City School Board sold Canton Academy a 1967 bus for $250. The Yazoo City School District sold a bus to its local academy for $126. Amity, Canton, and Yazoo County auctioned off school equipment at ridiculously low prices. For example, 50 cents for a desk. Tunica and Clay counties continued to keep private school teachers on their payrolls. The Forest County school system used its buses to transport children to the private school. Leake County Academy opened in 1970 in the old Madden School, a previous public school facility. A new private school in Carroll County opened on the Jenny McBride School Ground, a former school in the Carroll County public school system. The teacher apartments adjacent to the land were also leased to the new private school. The two public school teachers living in these apartments were ordered to vacate the building by July 1st, 1969. Madison County superintendent told the white students upon leaving for Christmas break in 1969 to take their textbooks with them to be used at the private schools. The state also furnished free textbooks to many private schools. In their 1964 instructions on how to start a private school, the editors of The Citizen urged citizen whites to take the free textbooks the state offered, but they added the following caveat. Free textbooks as a state handout are an instrument of cultural retardation and socialistic regimentation. However, they continued, we do not advise ideological puritanism in this regard. As a practical matter, it will generally be better for the time being, at least, to take the free textbooks from the state. Richard Brooks, who taught at Macon High School during the first years of desegregation, recalled that when almost all the white students left the Noxubee school system, suddenly textbooks seemed to disappear as well. When we came back in August, we saw all the books stacked up in the hall. We got new books, but all of a sudden the books disappeared, and we only got 20 books out of the original 160. All the new books went to the private school. So I didn't know how it happened or who called in, but anyway, the State Department came in and they wanted to know about the new books and why they were at the private school. And so the principal had to get two fellows to drive a truck to go down there and get the books because the State Department guy wouldn't leave. He said, "You're going to have your books back before I leave," and we did. They got all the books on the truck, and some of them already had names in them, so after that, we didn't have any more trouble with the books. During the 1971 to 72 school year, 34,000 students in 107 private schools in Mississippi received free textbooks, for which the state paid $490,239. Parents of students in Tunica County filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of all students in Mississippi, challenging the long-standing practice of the state providing free textbooks to students in private schools. The district court sustained the validity of the program, stating that the textbooks were going to students, not schools. On appeal, the Supreme Court ruled in Norwood versus Harrison 1973 that private schools have the right to operate, but free textbooks like tuition grants directed to private schools are a form of financial assistance injuring the benefit of the private schools themselves. Thus, if a private school in its admission policies discriminated based on race, the state by tangible aid in the form of textbooks thereby gives support to such discrimination. Racial discrimination in state-operated school is barred by the Constitution. Reluctant to make a blanket rule prohibiting any private school student from receiving free textbooks, the court ruled that to be eligible for state-provided free textbooks, the school must submit to the Mississippi Textbooks Purchasing Board certification of its non-discriminatory admission policies and an enrollment report listing the number of minority students in attendance. With so much public aid going to private schools, civil rights activists and attorneys in the early 1970s had to divert some of their energy from ensuring that schools complied with desegregation orders to challenging the actions of state and local governments in aiding the newly created private schools. In September 1969, civil rights attorneys joined by the Justice Department filed a suit in the federal court to block the $200 state loans to students 16 years and older. In their suit, they referred to the earlier court decision ruling that tuition grants to private schools were unconstitutional. They argued that a loan to students who could turn around and use it to pay private school tuition would have the effect of encouraging, facilitating, and supporting a system of private schools operated on a racially segregated basis. In June 1970, a group of black residents in Tate County filed a lawsuit against their superintendent and school board for 1969 sale of a former school building to Hillcrest Academy. The school board had sold the building to an individual acting on behalf of the Tate County Foundation, the private school organizational group. Board members contended they did not know the individuals purchasing it for the purpose of housing the private school, although they allowed workmen to begin refurbishing the building before the sale was final. In their lawsuit, the black appellants asked the building be returned to the school board. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. The court stated it was common knowledge to everyone in the town that a private school was being formed. The school board's contention it did not know the purchaser planned to use the building was irrelevant, since school boards are legally charged with the affirmative duty to work towards a unitary school system that is free of racial discrimination. The court reversed the lower district court ruling and ordered that the property be returned to the Tate County Board of Education. It added, it appears to be appropriate to express a caveat to courts who in the future may have to consider the sale of public school property for use as a private school. Such a sale should be scrutinized with utmost care and caution to the end that public school property shall not be converted to use by private schools which engage in forbidden discriminatory practices. Rather than forcing Tate Academy off its present site, Federal District Judge Orma Smith ruled in June 1972 that Hillcrest Academy could remain in the former public school building as long as the school did not deny black students admission. Civil rights attorneys disagreed with Smith's ruling, stating that the net effect of a public school to a private institution with or without an open door policy is furtherance of school segregation. Initial aid to private schools also came from the federal government through the IRS. A private school could qualify for tax-exempt status thus allowing individuals to claim their contributions to private schools as charitable giving on their tax returns. In July 10, 1970, the IRS announced that private schools that discriminate based on race would no longer be eligible for tax exemptions. 41 private schools in Mississippi were affected by the decision. Glenn Sweatman, former Biloxi School Board member and the president of the Harrison County Private School Foundation, reacted to the ruling with little concern. We don't see that it will make any difference in our operation whatsoever. Right, at first, we relied on donations, but now we are operating solely on our income. The only cause for alarm is that individual donations will not be tax exempt for the donors. I don't think it will cut down on our donations, however. Deflating the potential power of the ruling to curtail the growth of private schools, the IRS announced they would accept a private school's written declaration of non discrimination as proof of compliance. Accepting the word of private school administrators that they do not discriminate is palpably ridiculous, responded Senator Walter Mondale, chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Equal Educational Opportunity. In March 1971, the IRS revoked the tax exemptions of 23 private schools in Mississippi. Southwest Academy in Jackson was one of those. Its principal, Ralph Martin, appeared unfazed by this revocation when he told a reporter, "If we received public aid, we would be obligated to the government, and the less obligation you have to the government, the better position you are to provide the kind of education you want." William J. Simmons, director of the Citizens Council of America, which operated 5 private council schools in Jackson, concurred with Martin. "We don't want public aid, all we want is to be left alone. No Negroes have applied for admission, and we wouldn't admit them if they did." On June 30th, 1971, in Green versus Connolly, the United States District Court for the District of Columbia upheld the revoking of tax-exempt status for racially discriminatory private schools. However, for years, the IRS and private school supporters wrangled over the role of the IRS and its rules concerning tax exemptions for private religious schools. These schools claimed their policies and practices were protected on grounds of religious freedom. Finally, in 1983, the Supreme Court provided some clearer guidance in a ruling involving Bob Jones University from South Carolina. The government has a fundamental overriding interest in eradicating discrimination in education, discrimination that prevailed with official approval for the first 165 years of this nation's constitutional history. That governmental interest substantially outweighs whatever burden denial of tax benefits places on petitioners' exercise of their religious beliefs. Soon thereafter, many private schools rewrote their admission policies to include a non discrimination clause. Pragmatic economics, organized white resistance to private schools. In some school districts, the white flight to private schools was almost total, and many affluent whites paid the private school tuition of those who could not afford it. However, in some towns, white citizens waged a vigorous campaign to save our public schools. One of the most first organized groups to publicly vocalize its support for public schools was Mississippians for Public Education, MPE, formed in Jackson in 1963 by 5 middle class white women: Pat Darien, Elaine Crystal, Marianne Henderson, Joan Geiger, and Winifred Green. MPE did not consider itself a political group, and members prided themselves on being bipartisan. They had one clear cut goal: "We are not a forum for debating the pros and cons of desegregation or states' rights or any political question. Our goal is solely to protect, preserve, and promote our public school system." The MPE chapters were soon formed in Biloxi, Oxford, Greenville, Tupelo, and Meridian. They urged women to talk to their husbands and convince them to support public schools and to abstain from any forms of violence. They purchased pro-public school billboards in Jackson that proclaimed, "Their tomorrow depends on you today. Send your children to public school." In response to the legislature approving a state tuition grant of $185 to send children to private schools, MPE published a pamphlet entitled "A Time to Speak" that warned, "To responsible Mississippians, to slow erosion of our schools through impractical schemes like tuition grants would be a tragic waste. Closing our schools is unthinkable. Violence or occupation by federal troops would be catastrophic." 7 years later, in 1970, a similar organization formed, Jacksonians for Public Education. More than 200 people attended in its first official meeting on August 27, 1970, in Fondren Presbyterian Church. Its chief priority was to encourage whites to keep their children in public school and to support public school personnel. As discussed in Chapter 3, one of the ways in which Dr. Tom Doolin, superintendent of Winona, sought to ensure that whites stayed in public schools was to implement a policy barring public school teachers and principals from sending their own children to the private school. He was unsure of its legality, but no one ever challenged. In 1972, the Calhoun County School Board, upon recommendation of the superintendent and board attorney, adopted a similar policy. 8 white teachers in the district were not rehired because they enrolled their children at Calhoun Academy. 3 of them challenged the policy and sued the school district. They lost their case. The U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Mississippi ruled in Cook v. Hudson 1973 that the policy was reasonable and necessary for the preservation of public schools in Calhoun County. Public school desegregation in Calhoun County was a controversial policy which caused a division in the community. Many citizens immediately threw their support to continuing racial segregation in a private school to operate in competition with the public schools. Since white flight may present a serious obstacle to effective desegregation, a school board is empowered to adopt appropriate measures in aid of the schools under its charge. Educational psychologists testified to the potentially detrimental emotional and academic effects on the students, leading the court to conclude that school teachers who send their own children to a segregated school manifest a belief that segregation is desirable in education and a distrust in desegregated schools. Actions speak louder than words. In some communities, local businessmen were the moderate voices calling for whites to stay with our support or support the public schools. They argued that if their town wanted to attract business and industry, then a strong public school was imperative. Failure to support public schools from a business perspective would precipitate the economic ruin of a community. This was the argument consistently made by John Stone Jenkins, Dean of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. He called for the Jackson business community to unify around their public schools, telling them, if they make their mind up to make school desegregation work, then it will work. He illustrated his point by contrasting the towns of Canton and Macomb. In Macomb, the local leadership made up its mind to preserve the public schools and to make massive integration work. They brought in a young school superintendent, Julian Prince, to see that it was done. He integrated the schools before the court decision last winter, and he brought about more integration than the courts would have required. There is no private school system there today. In contrast, he noted that the business leaders in Canton made the opposite decision. The whites boycotted the public schools and started their own private academy. In Oxford, local business leaders and members of the University of Mississippi academic community led a successful pro-public school campaign that began with a group called the Oxford Civil Council, comprised of black and white members of 16 civic, service, and professional organizations. Its initial goal was to unite the black and white community around the preservation of public schools. Ed Meek was one of the original founders of the group. He explained how he and his wife were some of the first in their social group to make the decision to keep their children in the public schools. When it came time that Oxford had to integrate, I didn't have a single friend that said, I'm going to send my kids to public schools. And my wife and I both said, frankly, we've got to stay in the public schools. This community's got to have a good public school system, and rightfully, wrongfully, I remember, I said we recognized that probably the African American students were not at the same level as Caucasian students, but that's the price we're going to have to pay because this will all settle out. Ed began to hear talk about the forming of a private school in Oxford, and he knew that if the private school movement gained momentum in his hometown, the public schools in the town would suffer. As the president of the Junior Chamber of Commerce, he aggressively began contacting other leaders in town, including Willie B. Tankersley, the Chancellor's butler, and Ken Wooten, director of admissions at the University of Mississippi. The Oxford Civic Council met on January 12, 1970, at the Oxford City Hall and adopted a resolution expressing their unwavering commitment of public schools. We do hereby affirm our belief in free public education and pledge our support to the retention of public schools in general, and specifically to improving the quality of education in the Oxford Municipal Separate School District. In addition to the 16 members of the council unanimously supporting the resolution, other individuals added their names in support, including the mayor, the aldermen, members of the local clergy, several PTA presidents, the president of the Oxford Municipal School Board, and 4 board members. The Oxford Lafayette County Chamber of Commerce endorsed the resolution as well, with a request that the Lafayette school system be added to the wording of the resolution. Despite the school board's written support of the resolution, it was slow to develop any definitive plans on how the school system intended to comply with desegregation. This inertia drove the Oxford Civic Council to develop its own plan. Ed explained, when it was obvious that the leadership for the school board was not going to do anything, we said let's organize a town meeting and get black and white to come together and let's talk about this. Because we all have fears, we're all concerned, and we all know what we need to do to solve this issue ourselves and not somebody else. Ed contacted the chairman of the public school board to inform him that the Civic Council was planning to host a community wide event meeting at Oxford High to discuss what needed to be done to desegregate their schools. The chairman said, "No, we're not going to do it." Ed would not take no for an answer. He told them they planned to host the meeting whether the school board attended or not. The meeting was planned for Friday, January 16th, 1970. To publicize the meeting, the Civic Council placed a one-page ad in the local paper with the headline, "Public schools are vital to the Oxford University community." It also added, "Members of the Oxford Municipal Separate School Board will discuss plans for the second semester of school in the Oxford system." Between 12 and 1,300 people, both black and white, crowded into the Oxford High Auditorium. The local paper reported it was the largest crowd ever assembled at the school. Ed Meek presided over the meeting. The Chancellor of the University of Mississippi, Dr. Porter L. Fortune Jr., talked about the importance of having strong public school to attract the best faculty to the University of Mississippi. Another guest speaker, Doug McClary, manager of the U.S. Plywood, stressed the importance of strong public schools for recruiting employees to the already existing industries in Oxford and Lafayette County. Ken Wooten, chairman of the Education Committee of Oxford Civil Council, served as master of ceremonies. He described the meeting as, "We got to the school board on the stage. Fortune, who was chancellor of the university, made an address and plea for calm and for the continuation of public education. The fact that it's a must, we've got to have it. So then we turned to the school board. The auditorium was completely filled. We had to put speakers outside. There were people all out on the lawn and everywhere listening to see what the school board was going to do, how it was going to be handled. And so I turned to them and asked them a couple of questions. How many schools are there? How many school buildings do we have?" And they said 4. But that was not the end of what the Civic Council wanted to do. We wanted to make the transfer reasonable and without violence. Vocal public support continued for public schools as they prepared for the opening of the second semester on February 2nd, 1970. At the same time, several townspeople formed a new private school called College Hill Academy. In the January 22nd, 1970 issue of the Oxford Eagle, the Civic Council ran an ad, "We support public schools," with the names of 250 people who have already committed their support. And the College Hill Academy had an ad listing the names of the 15 members of their newly formed Board of Trustees with the statement, "Inquiries invited." The potential clash between the private and public schools played out quite visibly when on the same page of the February 3rd, 1970 issue of Oxford Eagle, there were two ads. The predominant one was the pro-public school ad with the headline, "Hats off to our public schools," followed by a listing of more than 400 people congratulating administrators, teachers, staff, city officials, school board for a job well done. To its left was a much smaller ad from College Hill Academy listing a membership of 191 students and 12 faculty with the announcements, "Classes will begin on Tuesday, February 17th. The January 29th, 1970 editorial summarized what the Oxford Civic Council hoped to accomplish. There prevails in Oxford a positive attitude both on the parts of the white and black community regarding the public school system. We feel that in this time of crisis that many forces in Oxford have mobilized and determined in one accord to make this work." College Hill Academy opened but never attained the enrollment of many other private schools begun during the era of school desegregation. It eventually closed, and today another private school, Regent School of Oxford, occupies its buildings. In Yazoo City, the business community also rallied around its public schools. But much different from the Oxford Civic Council, the business leaders in Yazoo City sought to support both a public and a private school system. The place is significant because a decade earlier, the local Citizens Council had so intimidated the 53 black residents who signed a petition demanding the schools integrate that no other petitions were filed in the state in the 1950s. In 1969, Yazoo City was home to the Mississippi Chemical Corporation, and a significant number of college-educated White residents, including John Satterfield, past president of the American Bar Association and the lead attorney for the school districts in the Alexander case. Yazoo City was also home to a large black population and a new private school, Manchester Academy. Yazoo City was one of the school districts named in the Alexander case, but instead of fleeing the public schools immediately upon the court's ruling, white business leaders decided to wage a massive campaign to support public schools. They called themselves Friends of Public Schools. Harold Kelly, superintendent during this time period, described the powerful influence of the public school advocacy group. We had what we called the people that had the children in the public schools. Some actually had their children in the private school that joined the group and said, yes, we've got to have good public schools from a business standpoint. They were very vocal about giving us support. Leading the efforts were two powerful men, Owen Cooper, president of the Mississippi Chemical Corporation, and Senator Herman DeSalle, elected in 1967. On November 24th, 1969, days after the Alexander ruling, more than 1,200 people met in the high school auditorium. Although dominated by white citizens, 200 blacks attended as well. 25 preachers, politicians, school leaders, parents, and businessmen spoke in support of the public schools. Harriet Cookendale, wife of Senator DeSalle and a teacher at the time, noted the importance of the pro-public school business community. Now we had developed a community in Yazoo City, a group of people called the Friends of the Public School, and they had a meeting one time in the high school auditorium. It's an 800-seat auditorium, and there wasn't a vacant seat in it. And these are adults, and they are not parents. This was not for parents of the public schools. This was friends of the public schools. For Harriet, who kept their children in the public schools, and many others in the established white power structure, the fact that members of the local business community rallied in public support of the public schools was far more important than the personal and individual choice they made about whether or not to send their children to the public school or to Manchester Academy. The local newspaper, similar to the one in Oxford, also publicly supported the public schools and ran editorials such as the following. Yazoo City has been fortunate in many crises because we seem to have a reservoir of enlightened readers, both black and white, willing to persevere through adversity and do what's right. We urge you all, our readers, to rise to the challenge of the transition being required of us. Certainly there will be perplexities of the problems of human misunderstanding, but also opportunities and inspirations to all children of this community and their future. When schools opened on January 7, 1970, under court-ordered desegregation, the majority of whites remained in the public schools for the first semester. Having the public and vocal support of the larger business community was responsible, according to Superintendent Kelly, for the passing of a bond issued the next year with 84% of the voters supporting it. As Kelly stated, that was very unusual at the time. Despite its support of many whites for public schools in Yazoo City, the public versus private school debate created divisions between whites in the community. Willie Morris recounts a conversation with the wife of a Southern politician who said, "You can't underestimate how all of this divided people, husbands and wives, children and parents, brothers and sisters, old friends." Harriet Cookendale quipped, "We agreed in my bridge club not to discuss it." Indeed, the debate among whites about public versus private schools often turned quite personal. Will you send your child to the public schools? The political becomes personal. Among the white educators interviewed for this study, no other topic generated as much emotion as that of private schools. Blame for the failure of public school desegregation and its effects on public schools today was often squarely placed on friends, coworkers, and family members who refused to stick it out and stay with public schools. Fred Perkins was a first-year principal in 1969 at Sunnyside Elementary in Leflore County, right outside of Greenwood when the Alexander ruling was decided. From stories he had been told, the area was a hotbed for Klan activity. He recalls men sitting in pickup trucks watching what he was doing in the school. He was rightly nervous keeping his lights on in his house during the night. We were there, just right in the middle of the Delta, on the edge of a cotton patch, and you didn't know what would happen. It was all a new ball game, and everybody was kind of nervous about what was happening. He tried to lead his school through the desegregation process, but the lure of the private school was powerful, and in the end, only a few poor whites remained in his school. He explains, and Pillow Academy left us stripped. Our school was stripped. We had 113 white kids that stayed. I've never thought private schools were a good idea. I thought they were just a way to get around integration, and like I say, my kids never set foot in a private school. And I wouldn't have let them. Paul Ma- Paula Mabry is also critical of the establishment of a private school in her hometown because Starkville could ill afford to financially support both a private and a public school system. Paula began teaching in 1970 at Starkville High, an academically strong high school with a national reputation for its arts program. It had 4 levels of theater classes, a highly touted band program, and it won the first Kennedy Center for the Arts Award, one of the only 2 recipients nationwide. With such a strong public school, Paula questioned why so many whites decided to send their children to Starkville Academy. With 2 school systems operating, local businesses either had to split their financial support between the 2 schools or choose to support only one. She explained the economic ramifications for a small and resource poor town like Starkville. I think because of the private school forming, there was a definite alignment of loyalty. You know, we are going to support this school and this football program, or we're going to support this school and this football program. And yes, I think some people were able to successfully support both, but primarily people made a choice. If you're the Coca Cola Company, you can give this much to this school and that much to this school. But if you're a small businessman and they want you to advertise in their football program or their annual, you might choose this school over that school. Jeer Nash, who was a school board member in Greenville during school desegregation, understood well the argument for why public schools are essential for economic development. When he discovered that a local realtor was informing newcomers to Greenville that the private schools were the only viable school option, he put a stop to it immediately. But more importantly, Nash viewed the support of public schools to be a moral issue, about which he was passionate. Nash was born in Greenville in 1928, the year after the Great Flood that wreaked havoc on the city of Greenville. Nash unabashedly blames private schools for the demise of public education in the city. I made the statement several years ago that we could overcome the flood, but it was going to be years before we overcame what the private schools were doing to the city of Greenville. He firmly believed that school desegregation could have worked if whites would not have abandoned them for the private schools. I was fool enough to think that 60-40 to 55-45 was a good mix. If every white child in the school system of Greenville went to the public schools, the ratio would have been 55-45. And I was fool enough to think, well, anybody can live with that. According to Jeer, his wife urged him to refrain from discussing private schools at dinner parties, but it was a topic about which he was passionate. I felt very strongly about public education and integration became a moral thing for me. Harding Carter Jr., a fellow resident and editor of the local paper, expounded on how emotional the private versus public school debate became in the white middle class circles of Greenville. For many whites who could afford private schools, it was a most agonizing kind of moral choice. And one of the reasons why decisions among old friends on this subject has been so great right here is simply because it was perceived finally not just a simple decision but about where your children goes to school, but a moral question which those who made on their way on either side felt pretty damn strongly about. And an awful lot of people lost their battle with their consciences. And a lot of other people surprised themselves by standing and then discovering, much to their fury, that people who they had always respected as being moderates, or people who cared about the community first, had suddenly deserted them. Here, they decided to stay in the public school and look around, and this person who they had always understood to be brighter or more of a moderate or whatever is off to the state academy. These agonizing moral decisions often created divisiveness within the white community. The most obvious manifestation was the violence and intimidation, slash tires, threatening phone calls, burned crosses, blown up mailboxes many whites experienced because of their decision to stay in public schools as teachers or principals, or to keep their children in public schools. In the early years of FOC in the Mississippi Delta town of Rosedale, Mike Johnson allowed a black boy to try out for the basketball team. The next night, a cross was burned in his yard. Mike's superintendent Gibley told him to buy a gun. His principal called the FBI. The following Sunday, the minister of his Methodist church preached an entire sermon condemning the actions of those who'd lashed against Mike and his family. When Mike moved to Leland in 1967 to take a coaching position, he was targeted once again, this time because he continued to teach in the public school rather than the transfer to the private academy. He described how he and his fellow white teachers were treated. Because we stayed in the public schools there as teachers, we had more things happen to me physically than happened in Rosedale. I don't know how many sets of tires I had to put on my car because the tires were cut. We had garbage thrown in our yard consistently over weekends. I had windows broken out of my vehicles, very bad phone calls, calls in the middle of the night and hang up. It is easy to cast these acts of violence as evidence of the divisions between the more radical racist whites and whites who appeared moderate because of their refusal to leave the public schools. However, the animosity between those who stayed and those who left often spilled over into the personal relationships of friends, family, and colleagues. Severed relationships, an invitation to a social event declined or never sent, a reserved, cold conversation with somebody once considered a close friend, or changes in church membership exemplified the subtle ways in which the private public school debate caused rifts within the white community. Mike Johnson explained there were some teachers who were good friends of ours who had been in the bridge clubs there in Leland that were not asked to come back to that bridge club. There were a lot of people whose church, the people who were in the church, who just did not have anything to do with them anymore because they stuck with the public schools and wouldn't go away. It was often students who most felt the rift created there when friendship groups were split up by their or their parents' choice decisions to leave the public schools. When he and his wife decided to keep their children in the Greenville public schools, William Dodson, a principal, noticed that his daughters suddenly were not invited to birthday parties or social events. As white students left Greenwood High in droves, a distinct and often hostile division arose between those who attended Pillow Academy and those who stayed in the public schools. Mary Carroll Miller, who stayed at Greenwood High, acutely felt this separation. Prior to 1970, she and her friends dismissed Pillow Academy as the place where the radical racist went, and the kids who didn't fit in, and the puny guys who couldn't play football at Greenwood. However, after many of their friends left Greenwood High for Pillow Academy, the animosity between the two groups of whites worsened over the years. Mary Carroll recalled, "We felt betrayed by those who left, and it felt like they bailed out for social reasons and their parents' pressure and who knows what reason, but we dug our heels in and stayed. But you had a real rift in the classes from that point on. One particular day at a pep rally, the enmity between the two took a public ugly turn." Mary Carroll described what happened. "At that point, the blacks would stay on one side of the gym and the whites would stay on the other, and a big group from Pillow came into the gym. A big group of my classmates who had left a couple months before and gone to Pillow came in, and they came in a door where the blacks could see them come in, and they got quiet at first. I remember the blacks just quit yelling, and we couldn't see who was coming around the side of the bleachers. And it was the big group of mainly girls from Pillow Academy. And this was a big deal. When they came around where we could see them, the band stopped. They just stopped. And one of the senior cheerleaders went over and got the microphone and said, 'This is not your place. Leave. Go away.' And they did. They turned around and walked out, and we continued with that pep rally." Mary Carroll and her white classmates viewed the Pillow students coming to their pep rally as a serious breach of the unstated but understood rules of how members of this deeply divided white community were to act and interact with each other. She explained how the harassment accelerated. "You had a real rift in classes from that point on. So there was more verbal jousting and trouble between the split whites than there were between the whites and blacks, and it got pretty ugly, at least while I was there. With guys in particular, they would on Friday night, Saturday night ride around, and the kids at Pillow would come paint tech on Greenwood High School or on the parking lot, or and our guys would go out and paint redneck tech on theirs. There was just a lot of friction." Mary Carroll's parents gave her the choice to either stay in the public school or attend Pillow Academy. Mary Carroll was adamant about staying, so much so that when the conditions of Greenwood High deteriorated to the extent that her parents felt she was not getting the education she needed, Carroll graduated a year early rather than transfer to Pillow Academy. The cost of choice: private schools deepening racial divisions. Private schools afforded an option to white parents and students during school desegregation not available to any black students despite their academic or athletic achievements and accomplishments. As Fenton Peters, a black principal in Starkville during this time period, declared, "Blacks had no choices. We only had the public schools." Despite euphemistic references to quality education and safe schools, the original purpose of these academies was to promulgate segregation based on the pervasive beliefs of many that blacks were inherently socially, culturally, and educationally inferior to whites, as Charles George, a black educator who began his teaching career in the segregated schools of East Tallahatchie, pointedly noted, "As far as helping the county or the town working together, private schools didn't help. In other words, we are better than you are. We are going to do our own thing." In other words, they just thought they were more superior. Lucy Boyd concurred. She was a president of the local NAACP chapter in West Tallahatchie for 22 years and was one of the black parents who filed the desegregation lawsuit against her district. She conceded that the creation of the private school in her community may have kept total eruption from happening, but the reasons why whites left the public school was very clear to her. I saw the influx of white students being pulled out and the pouring in of resources to build that school, Delta Academy, and I just couldn't see it being done for the right reason, just to avoid being with students of another race, with black students. As Lucy's comment highlights, choice for white students in the form of private academies had significant consequences for black students. Whites who opted out of the public school soon divested themselves from any emotional or financial investment in public schools. Without such support, bond issues and tax increases to help fund public schools typically failed, all of which had devastating effects on black students. Herbert Foster, a black educator who began his teaching career in 1971 in Cleveland, explains the detrimental effects of private schools. Private schools were not a good thing because if you remove yourself from the public setting, you're not going to do anything to really support the school. I think if they would have accepted the fact that we had just one school and we're going to make it the best school it can possibly be because they wouldn't have had a choice. As long as they had a choice, they didn't put any effort to make the public schools better. They didn't push hard enough for an increase in taxes in support of the public schools. While many private schools today distance themselves from their segregationist origins, the residual effects of private schools are apparent, particularly in the Delta. Their presence still evokes strong emotions. When the organizers of her 30th high school reunion decided to have a joint celebration for graduates of Pillow Academy and Greenwood High, Dr. Mary Carroll Miller refused to attend the joint reunion. She blamed the dismal state of public education today in Greenwood in part on the whites who left the public schools during school desegregation. I still like to think that if we go back 40 years and there was not movement here to start a private school, and you had kept every child in there and kept the talents and administrative skills and money, for lack of a better word, all those parents who pulled out, if you could have kept all that in the public schools, then you would not have had that backwards and downward slide. The ultimate form of resistance: leave the public schools. On January 2nd, 1970, the Southern National Party organized a rally in Jackson in hopes of precipitating a statewide response to school desegregation that would protect your children from being exploited by tyrannical federal government bureaucrats. They billed the rally as offering a workable solution to the school crisis. The workable solution they proposed was to start a foundation that would help every community organize a private educational system. The Southern National Party never gained much traction. However, the private school movement thrived in the years following the Alexander ruling. In the end, the withdrawal of 20% of white students from the public schools would be the most consequential form of white resistance to the school desegregation. And that is the end of Chapter 9 of Just Trying to Have School.